afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to our BBSSH Asia Pacific meetup. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. For me, it's the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today as well. Tonight, we've got an interesting topic on governance and why it's a leadership priority for organisations. For those of you that I have not met before or crossed paths with, my name's Mark Payne. I'm the principal consultant here for Sooner Safer Happier Asia Pacific. My background is about specialising in what we refer to as the system of work design. So system of work design definitely encompasses things like how would we redesign governance to enable better flow and more efficiency in the way that we get things done. And today I have some fellow thought leaders here on the topic of governance, Tony, Ponton and Phil Gadzinski, the authors of Govern Agility. Governance and agility are not often words that you kind of hear working well together, but in the book, both Tony and Phil argue that these things can not only coexist, but when it's really done well, and having seen it done firsthand well, it can definitely be a true enabler for speed, flow, and business agility. And so it's definitely something that all organisations should start to think about and how they optimise. So with that, I might do some introductions. So Tony, I might hand to you first if you'd like to introduce yourself to the group.
Hey, I'm Tony Ponton. I've been doing the Agile thing for about, I like to say this is my third decade. That stops Phil from saying I'm old. I grew up in agility and spent a lot of time working with organisations in transformational spaces. And of course, part and parcel of that is governance and agility. I was mixing that together. So that's me.
Thanks, Tony. So yeah, Phil Gadzinski. So he's stolen my joke. I'm going to have to move on to another one. But basically, I've been, I guess, in and around agile delivery, software delivery, programs, transformation change for, I think it's about 2006. So whatever that is. So again, not quite 3 decades, but we're starting to get there. But I think my last sort of major related role was as the head of transformation for Bupa for Asia Pacific, which included things such as governance and portfolio management and change and organizational design and all the things that Mark talked about at the start. So some of the ideas that we talk about in the book are things that we've either seen or done ourselves, tried to put into practice, and then ultimately sort of tried to codify how we saw those things and make those sort of available and shareable for others to sort of leverage. So I guess that's what brings us here today, Mark. A little bit around us and maybe over to you for the first few questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Phil and Tony. So let's jump into it. So if we think about the starting point for this, I always think about, well, what's the problem or how do we frame the problem that we're trying to solve? So if we think about it in that context, what do you believe is the biggest misconception about governance in an agile ways of working or in an organisation aspiring for greater agility? And how do you think it's holding those organisations back? What are your thoughts?
I'll go first a little bit, Tony. And I know you've probably got some great stories to back in with. Everyone know the Business Agility Institute? I'm going to take it as probably you've heard of it or you've been involved with it, you know, a little bit about it. If you don't, definitely look it up. There's a whole bunch of sort of research material and things on that are really quite interesting. So they published a stat not that long ago that most transformations, sort of agile organizational transformations, don't tackle governance until about the 5th year of their transformation. So what we see is for 5 years, we've got a system of assurance and control, the processes and practices that are in place to actually assure the work. So I want a thing. Am I getting the thing done? How am I getting that thing done? We don't address those. So what we see is for that period before people sort of realize, actually, we think this is a thing that's constraining us. We see constraints in transformation and change. So you start out with a goal, an outcome, or a system change you might want to see, but then you govern it the way you've governed all your other work. And those two things cause friction and they cause tension. And one tends to slow the other down. So maybe Tony, you wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, so if I take from Phil there, you asked about the misconception, I guess, Mark. And the misconception is that governance and agile are oil and water. But the reality is that they have to exist together, particularly in corporate environments. You can't have a corporate environment without governance. And if you're attempting to be in an organisation that's able to adapt, you need agility. How do you make the two work? Unfortunately, what's happened is we've created what we call the complexity ceiling over the years. And we call it the complexity ceiling. You end up paying a complexity tax based on that complexity ceiling. And what I mean by that is that basically you have your strategic intent and your leadership flowing in one way. They know where they're going generally. If that's not, then I say, well, that's a whole different conversation to today, right? And we spend a lot of time in agility and transformations becoming we don't get the value out of our transformation because we spend it at the building the teams and workflows and tribes, squads, pods, etc. Right? I can rave on all the different names. What we don't do then is we leave, as Phil said, we leave that layer of governance and funding, and they're both intertwined. And the reality is that you become transitional, not transformational, because you hit that complexity ceiling and your organisation then intends to pay this complexity tax. And the worst thing about that complexity tax, it's in the tens of millions, not tens of thousands, right? But it's even worse. It's in people, it's in time, and it's in value delivered. And organisations now, we're hearing this whole thing about agile is failing. And the reality of that's not the case. The case of that is, and the misconception about that you hear is because governance and agility are at odds. When what we actually need is the two of them working together to create the flow. Phil, I can see you championing.
Yeah, I was gonna, you can see the look. I was gonna build on it. So the build is it's largely, it's not anyone's fault, but there's almost like a finger at the Agile community itself a little bit, which is from day one, Agile was about freedom and autonomy, and I'm going to be an autonomous team, and I'm going to go in my own direction, and all those things. And then you get the leadership grow. I want servant leaders, and Tony loves this one. I want you to be a servant leader, and we've got groups of Agile coaches and people going to leadership, telling them you're doing everything wrong. So you've instantly created this tension and friction. So the people that own the governance are going, yeah, right, is that right? So this is how I'm going to assure you I'm not changing that because I don't trust you. Because you come in with a whole system and process and mindset and behavior and culture, which I don't understand. And you're not helping me to understand it, which I think is largely the fault of the Agile community in the past. So I'm going to govern you exactly the same way as I govern all my other work until proven otherwise. And that's where you get the friction and the tension. And that's the other big misconception, is that within agility, there isn't any discipline, there isn't any process, there isn't any structure, there isn't any guidance. And we talk about that a lot in the book. We use sort of different terms for it. But the idea is to be a really high-performing agile team in a large organization. You still need all those things. They're just run and managed differently. And that's, I think, the other key misconception.
Yeah, you have to interact within that ecosystem of the governing of the system. Otherwise, you hit the complexity ceiling, right? And I'm a bit harder than Phil. How do we get there? We, the consultants, did it. We, the agilists, did it. We, the leadership, did it. We, the executives, did it. And you know why we did it? Because it was too damn hard. We put governance over in the corner and said it's easier to build the tribes, the squads, the pods, create that flow at the team level. But the reality of it is, and the misconception is that governance is the big bad ogre over here that's stopping us from getting the work done. Where the reality is if you imbibe the governing systems into your agility systems, you end up with flow.
And that's part of the shifts, isn't it? Part of the shifts you kind of want to see across sort of different stakeholders when you think about people who play roles in the system.
And stakeholders, flow, like they're definitely all the key things that we're looking for, Tony and Phil. I think the thing that I reflect on the most when I think about misconceptions or things that are holding organizations back is I don't think organizations have come to the realization that you can separate out governance for investment and governance for delivery. At the moment, they're tied together in one thing, which is a business case, and then it forces everything down a business case path at the initiative level. So it's starting to think about how that can be unwound. But with with that as a lens, and an opportunity to unwind or tackle things, what is the mindset shift that you see that leaders need to make to govern for agility rather than for pure control? And any learnings, any examples from organizations that you've worked with or that have since read the book that have, been able to start to pivot and shift in that area?
So Phil immediately just looked at me because he knows this is my favorite topic.
Oh, great.
So look, with the leadership, I see there's a number of things that we see, right? And I talk about it in terms of abdication rather than involvement. Because of the way we've set our governing systems, leadership and executives over a period of time have abdicated the responsibility of governance to singular entities within their organizations or multiple single entities. So you can take that any way you like PMOs, VMOs, CMOs, I get all the O's right, CROs, risk, that kind of thing, right? And they've abdicated that responsibility rather than being involved. And then they take the feed from that and wonder why they end up in a situation where they find out about it when it's happened, when it's about to happen, when it's causated, the problems within their organization. So the first mindset change that we look for when we talk to leaderships, and those organizations that I see that doing well, is that they're actually involved in the governing of the systems. They understand the governing systems, and they've enabled their people to make those changes themselves and govern the system. So that's a big thing as well. Because if you're the leadership and you're the one who's actually making all the decisions, or you've abdicated it to a singular area to make all of those decisions, you haven't created flow. What you've created is a bottleneck. And then that becomes an issue for the organisation. Phil, I can see you champion it a bit there.
Yeah, it comes down to decision making a lot as well. Like within a sort of legacy, large scale organization, 20, 30, 50,000 people, whatever it is, like it's really difficult to let go of control. And I think it's difficult to let go of control anytime, depending on what sort of the nature of you as an individual. But I think the big shifts you want to see when you want to shift your governance system is, where does control sit and how does it manifest and how does it get used? So we talked about leadership a little bit, but without changing the way you gather information and gather data, you're not going to let go of control. So I think this sort of refers back a lot to the book as well. The first topic or the first chapter we've got is around leadership. It starts with different leadership. But then it goes into transparency, then it goes into data. So basically, without information being surfaced to help you sort of relinquish control and decision making, it becomes very hard to let things go. But with really good information being surfaced around system and work and delivery and process and all the things you want to see, of which without going on too much of a tangent, we did say, Mark, for too many tangents, you got to bring us back. But without going too much
And
on a
more
bit of a tangent, workflow management systems are so critical to helping change the way you govern and change the way you make decisions or where you make decisions. With a good workflow management system connecting strategy to execution, you can actually start to let things go a bit more because you can just click your button and check the dashboard. But I'll fundamentally let you make decisions within this box, these guide rails, these boundaries. But I can see what you're doing. I can verify it because I've got the data. So that's been surfaced. So I'm going to trust you, but I can verify what you've done. And I think that again is another critical bit that we talk about as well, is that without the ability to then interrogate what's going on and what's happened, you're not going to let control go in a large organization because you've got stakeholders to keep happy. You've got goals to meet, you've got targets. Sometimes that doesn't filter through to people in teams, but that's critical for a leadership group. They're not going to let control go if they don't think they're meeting their goals and targets and don't have a way to validate what you're doing is what you said you would be doing. So these things all kind of start to mesh in together a little bit.
And I guess that's where Phil mentioned it before, servant leadership. So, okay, I did mention before that I've been doing this agile thing for a very long time. I've never been a fan of servant leadership. I'm still not a fan of servant leadership in terms of the term. What it means, I'm all for. However, I've never spoken to an executive leader, and my role is to talk to leaders a lot, whoever gelled with that term. In fact, I often say it in here, I had one tell me, I'm no servant, buddy. I don't even pick up after my kids. Right? That's not what we're looking for. So when we were writing the book, well, we actually came across and we decided around is conductive leadership. And the reason we call it conductive leadership, we know there's leading with intent and intent-based leadership, etc. We gel with all of those. But conductive leadership for us encapsulates all of those. And why we talk about that is if you think about a conductor, do you see them actually in the workflow? Do you see them doing the work? Do you see them playing the notes? However, they're orchestrating and they're actually creating the flow and they're making strategic intentions. And believe it or not, those strategic intentions are the use of the stick, and you'll see them pointing and etc. Phil plays a bum note, which we'd expect. He gets a double tap from the stick to let him know that he needs to intervene and he needs to make a decision in there. Right? So you can see that. What else do? They set up the guide rails versus the guardrails. And that's an interesting thing. You talked about, what do they need to unwind and what do we need to change in terms of leadership, is thinking about the guardrails versus the guide rails. What I mean by that, we use those two terms very carefully. Guardrails are the things that are the last protector of you before if you're on a cliff or something like that, it's supposed to stop your car from going over the edge, God forbid, right? Same for an organisation. They should be those governing principles or those governing things that are the last thing to stop the organisation from doing something it shouldn't do. Unfortunately, over the many years of not looking after the governing systems, these have been built up. Something went wrong, something went wrong, something went wrong. And so often we walk into organisations that actually they've built it up so much the leadership doesn't even know why they're doing it. They're just doing it because they're there. And that's why you want to look at guide rails, because you can set the guide rails at a level so that people can make decisions where the work gets done at the flow. That allows the work to flow. So the decisions that are coming up are those ones that Phil said. You can see, you can have those interventions, you can make those differences to those when you can see them and make the expedient decisions. So guide rails and guardrails and leadership using those and being part of it. Mark, I think you asked for an example. I was working with an organisation who very highly governed, governmental organisation. Everything went, the decision would go to one person. And we had them in a workshop and we were talking about this. And someone stood up and said, well, that's all great, but I can't make the decision. He makes all the decisions. Now, that leader could have just taken that, kept it. But in fact, what he actually did was he stopped and said, well, hang on a moment. I've been listening to this. Actually, I can set a bunch of guide rails for you guys where you can make decisions that I'm happy for you to make. And these decisions are the ones that I need. And that organisation made a big change. Immediately, the work started to flow. So we see this happening quite regularly. So that, for me, those are intertwined. Phil, you got anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, you talked about guide rails. One of the other key things that we sort of base a lot of our governance principles and approach on is guide rails are movable. Guardrails are generally not. So the idea of, in our book, we call them stanchions. We'll tell you the stanchion story as well. So you go to the cinema. So if you go into the cinema or the footy, wherever you go, and you see the guide rails, like the ropes on the poles, sort of directing people where they want you to line up. Those poles are stanchions. So what they're doing with those ropes and poles is setting a flow of how they want people to come into the cinema, get their ticket, whether it's lining up for concessions, whatever it might be. But as soon as they need to change direction, they pick the pole up and they put it somewhere else. So that's why it's a guide rail. And that's kind of why we use that within the book. So if a guide rail is not working for you, this is where the agile bit comes in as well. So inspect, adapt, reflect, improve. If something's not working for you, move the guide rail until it's actually working for you. You can't do that with a guardrail. So I think that's another critical leadership element as well, is if governance isn't quite working for you, change it. How many times have you actually seen an organization take the time to revisit its governance approach? It's pretty close to zero, if anything. Maybe there's a little bit around the edges and maybe there's some new process here or there. But I don't think anyone's actually, except for one company we'll talk about in a minute, which kind of was the genesis of all this work anyway. I kind of don't think I've seen too many organizations sit back and go, let's really revisit our governance principles, processes, practices, systems, whatever, for how we want to work and operate, aware of the things we must do. I don't think you actually see that. But the story we've got, so where did this actually all come from? A few years back when Tony and I were consulting together, which was a government department as well, quasi-government department, we got asked to go into a consulting engagement reviewing a new governance approach at a quasi-government department. which actually broke all the principles, processes, and practices and things they'd used before. So commissioned by the chief operating officer and the CEO because they went, actually, this looks good, but I'm not sure. Is this the right thing we should do? So basically, all the things that we talk about today that we saw in that engagement were around changing their governance system to allow their delivery teams to be more agile. So it's kind of that piece of work was working with that government department, finding those things that they'd implemented and go, actually, you know what, we've seen this stuff before. That looks pretty good. How might you turn that into something a bit more codified? Was kind of the whole genesis of where we've got to today with the book. So if a government department or a semi-government department can do it, there's probably no reason no company can sit back and relook at their governance.
It's very true. Two things out of that. I'll just jump in very quickly. Stanchions.
Yeah, no.
Okay. We love stanchions. So if you see photos of stanchions wherever they are, please send them to Phil on LinkedIn. He loves them. Sorry, I do that to him. Everything we do.
I'm getting a few.
Love it.
I said it all started from my wife seeing one, and we send him and we say, these are the stanchions in the wild, Phil.
Awesome.
I saw quickly a question pop up, and I might just grab that at the same time, Mark, if that's okay. Somebody said, can you give examples of the guide rail? So we'll just use that example because it's a really poignant example, right? This was an organization we went in, this area that was working within the agility. They actually had one of the best setups I've literally have ever seen. They could actually, the government area, they actually had their system set up with automated testing, etc. They could go to prod every hour on the hour if they wanted to. They were that good. I literally have not seen anything that as smick as that in a long, long time, right? The problem for them, though, was the guardrails that were set. They had to wait for the cab and they had to wait for their quarterly, and it would take them 3 to 4 months before they could release anything. So you couldn't understand the frustration felt through that, right? So through what we did with them in applying the stanchions, what they actually ended up doing, they never got to every hour on the hour, right? But they were able to break that down to a fortnightly and a monthly release. And the way they did it was the setting of the guardrails were built around their automated test dashboards. So your green, red, and adding some more data to that so that what they could do, instead of having to go and fill out this reams of documents and go through and everybody's asleep by the end of the cab, they could go through to the change people. Change people would look at that. They could flag what they needed to. They could raise what they needed to up. But this set of guide rails said, you can do this up to this decision point, and we're giving you, the change people, the ability to say, yeah, go to prod, rather than waiting all the way through these massive practices. So that's an example of how you can make change.
It's a great example, and good call out, Tony, as well. The Jen is tracking the comments for questions that'll come through, and yeah, we'll definitely scoop some more of these up a little bit later on as we create some time for some questions at the end. In listening to your responses, a lot resonates with me. So when I talk about the system of work, the system of work includes things like strategic alignment that you mentioned, Phil, using data to review those things. Tony talking about orchestrating, the flow of delivery through it, guardrails. So all of those resonate really well. I think the other things that I also think about when I'm looking at governance systems and systems of work is cadence. Obviously, it has a natural connection to flow. So how do we think about the cadence in which the organization operates or teams operate within? And then the other one that I tend to look at is a holistic step back review at the overall control environment, which actually then starts to tease out the guardrails and the guardrails and guide rails. Really like those. The reason for framing that is leading into the next question. We do see a lot of organizations that fall into the trap of just retrofitting traditional governance into agile delivery, or organizations aspiring for agility. What advice would you both give to leaders that are trying to break this pattern and wanting to do things a little bit differently? Any advice for them?
Yeah, super good question. It can be a bit overwhelming if you kind of think like, we work like this today and we have an aspiration. How am I going to change all these things at once? Well, that's the first bit of advice. Don't change everything at once, because that's going to end up in a zero-sum game. The more effort you try to put in a big batch shift like that, the less likely you're going to succeed. So for us, it's kind of taking stock of where you are today, which is like just standard lean thinking, right? Like where Kaizen thinking, where am I today? Start where you are. What do I do to use information to make decisions? How are my teams organized to execute? What's the transparency level like? Where's information flowing? Where is it not? What's the decision-making models? So all those kind of key elements. So I think you need a really good systemic review of that to figure out where you are. And then off that, you want to go, well, what's the first sort of priorities that I think that I can take as an organization, which allow a incremental change? And there's a couple of a couple of ways to play it out. And you can either go real large scale step changes, or you can just be going constant, ongoing incremental change. I don't know. I think the jury's still out a little bit on whether one's better than the other. I don't think either's better than the other. I think it's going to come down just to the context that you're starting in and the level you're starting at. If you find an organization where, you know what, you're still on a 6-month delivery cycle or even quarterly, it's hard to push change in, governance is stifling flow, there's limited transparency, it's a low trust culture. That's probably almost an environment to go, you know what, we're actually significantly going to disrupt stuff. Hey, we're going to move from project to product, whatever the thing might be, right? Oh, we're going to shift the way we work here to that, and we're just going to do a batch change because this is so bad and so far away from where we want to be, they just have to rip a band-aid off. I kind of think most organizations are probably in the middle where you want a bit of incremental stuff. And the one for me is always around data. So what's the information I've got today?
Yep.
What does that information actually tell me? How do I collect it? And do I use it for decision making? The amount of organizations that have workflow management systems in, so they're using Jira or ADO or whatever, teams are all tracing their work, but then don't use that for prioritization conversations. Don't use that really for sort of higher order planning meetings is still pretty surprising. You see it a lot. It's kind of like, oh, that data's for over there. It's not for the system. When really that's the kind of information you want to service. So for me, it starts with trying to create visibility of the work and elevating that data that you can find. And then you can start your change programs off the back of that. So I think critical start points.
So I two points there. So risk, risk appetite adds to the decision of change, right? And if I go back to my original organisation, which was a large enterprise organisation, where I met Mark, many years ago, when we did the actual business agility, we were one of the first people to do this business agility type agile transformation. And again, the governance thing reared its head. So it goes back even that far, right? And one of the things that I noted in that was we had to bring them close to the mix, the governance people. Bring them close to the mix. And so they can actually affect the change as well and understand the risk. So the risk appetite then starts to pare itself away as they understand the change. Because what happens is otherwise the risk appetite is high and then the control mechanisms get put in place, etc. Right? Once they understand how things work and how they can embed the risk, we have a saying in the book, it's a Kent Beck one we love from XP, silence is the sound of risk piling up, right? So risk and governance people love nothing more actually than to get the real-time data rather than the retrospective data. So Phil's point there is really important. The other thing I overlay over the top of that, you asked about, when you do this, there's a really simple sort of set of principles that I use and Phil uses when we talk to them about addressing these governing systems as leadership. Is you said it's very hard to make that change, right? So when you look at it, you want to unwind it a little bit. How do you unwind it and understand how to incrementally change what we've been? So the principle always applies, what we're the usual what, why are we going to do this? When are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? Who's going to make that decision?
Yeah.
And the big one is when are we going to make that decision, right? So if you apply those decisions against that, you'll actually find that you start to have the conversations as why are you doing this in the first place? And I'll give you, I knew when you asked me some real examples, I'll give you a real example. It's funny because it bounced out of COVID, but it's one that sticks in my head. We've been working with an organisation doing this stuff and the leaders, obviously right in the middle of it, we got hit with COVID and you know how much fun that was, right? And then we sort of, afterwards, all that happened, and then we readjourned and came back together, and we were talking to them about this, and one of them said, "Well, actually, it's really interesting. We're about to make some serious change here, and it's off the back of thinking about those kind of principles, right? Is that actually to get the work done? in this remote instance thing that's happening, we actually had to take away a whole bunch of those guide rails and just make it happen. And nothing happened. So now what we're doing is we're actually going back through them all and addressing them all. So they actually went through, 20, 30 years of this risk apparatus and control apparatus that they'd put in place and pared it right back because they found that they could create flow by doing so.
So there's some data. There's some data to bring that one to life as well. So the large organization that I was working with, we just started to measure sort of productivity at a team level.
Yep.
COVID hit. We found that teams on average went up 30% in terms of productivity because of those reasons Tony was talking about. We just removed the things that were getting in the way, slowing down execution. It didn't really need to be there. Just 30% more productive, like within a couple of months. It was pretty astounding.
I saw something similar with a whole of organization transformation that I was involved with, where we just flow mapped like the release process, and then without making any technical changes, we just looked at decision making, what could be made as close to the squad as possible versus outside of the squad, and we doubled the volume of releases just by improving the decision making as close to the squad as possible. So it definitely aligned with what you guys experienced there about sometimes it doesn't have to be all of it. It can just be elements to get it refined.
If you're listening to this, go away tonight or go away and look at your organisational construct and those things you're making. Decide when to decide how to decide who to decide why you decide. Apply them against the decisions. All of a sudden, you'll be asking and having different conversations with your leaders, or you'll be having different conversations if you're a leader with yourself.
Yeah, great call out. So this topic then leads into the next series of questions. But when I start working with an organisation, I do look at them as a blank sheet of paper and then understand the constraints to come in. And I have a pattern that I refer to as the delivery spine. And the delivery spine starts to look at things like where do we need to business case versus not? What would be the universal control environment that everyone would adhere to versus not, depending on the work? How does that interplay with cadence and get things flowing? And then where do we need an element of traditional versus more agility in our ways of working? So that kind of leads to some pathway elements design. The reason why I'm thinking about this in relation to this next question is, if you both had clean sheets of paper and were able to redesign governance for the 21st century, what would stay and what would go? Based on, since writing the book, talking to organisations, learnings that they've brought back to you. Yeah, what would stay and what would go from your perspectives?
That's an interesting question. That one. The first thing that would go for me is these centralised methods or orchestrations of decisioning, and it sounds like a pretty straightforward one. I don't know if many people here remember Pat Reed. Pat Reed was a wonderful adaptive portfolio lady, and she used to, one of the things she drilled into me about portfolios or PMOs or EPMOs, whatever you want to, they call them BMOs now. What else do they call them? All sorts of things they call them now, right? Their job is not to actually govern the system. Their job is to create the flow and orchestrate prioritisation, orchestrate decisioning, etc. That's the first thing for me that would go, is there centralised decisioning mechanisms that choke the daylights out of your organisation, where everything has to go there and everything has to be controlled from there and then goes to leadership. So for me, there would be the removal of that and the creation of your ability to see your strategic intent linked to your execution linked to your strategic intent. So you have that biflow of information backwards and forwards, and using the tools in the real time rather than retrospective. Phil, I can see you amusing, huh?
Funding work. So the fundamental problem we always fall into generally is, like, historically, change has been driven by a project because that's something different. It's not the run, it's the change. Whereas most companies born in the late 20th, early 21st century, whatever, tech native, digital native, they don't do that. They just run product teams and do the next most important thing that they need to do to increase revenue or cut costs or get customers or whatever. They don't turn around and go, hey, we need 20,000 new customers. Let's fund a project that's going to roll the widget out. No, they turn around and go, XYZ team, your next priority needs to be this, thanks. And they just measure the delivery of that. So I think that legacy world of which we still haven't broken and probably won't break because finance controls and systems are so pervasive and so ingrained is the other thing that's got to go. Just kind of the finance control and systems and the way that they are static. I mean, you ever tried to shift an SAP model out? You've ever tried to shift Oracle out? Like it's virtually impossible. Like these things are just in the middle of everything, and your whole finance team is captured by it. Probably not by choice; they just feel captured by it. So they can't change that, and if they can't change that, then they don't feel they can change the way they fund things. I think you can, but it's kind of the next step evolution. So I think getting rid of the way we actually do finance and accounting today, accounting treatments, that can be different. With a view of, the future state is I'm just funding teams of people because I've got to pay it anyway. So I'm just funding teams of people who are going to do the next things that I need them to do. I think that's that's the next kind of real critical. Keep that, get rid of that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
I think
When I was
the other one for me is the design of your system of work. Yeah. So if I was going to change things, designing the system of work for so again, you're going to get me started, but a little tangential, but it has a comment.
That's all right. Go for it.
It's one thing I hate, and I've been around and doing this for a long time, as I said before. Sticky teams. I've been working in agility for the better part of my life, and I think I've seen one true sticky team in the entire time. And even now, because of the intrinsic VUCA, those kind of things that are happening now, right? Those teams now need the ability to actually be dynamic teams that are able to flex and shape with the organisation. I go back to Heidi Heflin's book, right? If you haven't seen her dynamic teaming book, it's going to change. So you better get good at it. But I extrapolate that even further. Your organisation is going to change. So you better get good at it. Therefore, your governing systems need to change and be adaptive, right? And this is where the agility comes in. So for me, it's the flex of understanding, maybe the construct of the team might change, but you're going to need the ability to adapt and imbibe the different capabilities into that. So that dynamic reteaming, that dynamic organizational design to adapt and to be able to actually relate to the VUCA. So when we talk about VUCA, if everybody, hopefully this is a cast where everybody knows VUCA, right? We all know the external volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity out there, and what's right. But what a lot of organizations don't take into account when they're designing themselves, and if we had a blank piece of paper, you said, they're not thinking about the intrinsic VUCA. The intrinsic VUCA is that boiling pot that's trying to respond to the external VUCA. And so it's simplifying the flow of our organizational teams, information and governing systems that allow us to adapt and respond to that, in a dynamic way.
It's a great call out. And when I was reflecting on that question ahead of this session as well, it's funny I landed in the same spot as both of you. But with you, Tony, around the policing function and you, Phil, around the funding bit, because intrinsically organisations are just wired to fund initiatives. Like that's how it's always done from the word go. And then it's the policing function to take it through the stage gates to make sure that it's being controlled in a certain way. And so, when we're facing into that system of work redesign to enable these things, it's actually about, as you called it out before, PMO to VRO. So how does it shift from controlling to enabling? And then how do we shift from funding initiatives to funding for persistency? So we're definitely aligned on thinking there. if those are some of the big macro shifts that need to happen at the organizational level, before we open it up to some questions from the audience, what's your advice to agile coaches or change agents or leaders that are on this call this afternoon or this evening, for maybe one thing that they could do tomorrow to start improving governance in their context?
Oh, I had a view, but I was going to answer a totally different question then. But you go first, Tony.
Oh,
I know what they should be doing tomorrow differently. That's a separate topic. But
Look, I think, and let's say Phil and I are not just sitting here and going, you know, oh, you can go away tomorrow. I go, it's going to happen, and there's no genie moment, right? I don't have a hair, and I certainly don't have the magic powers. So, ability to change everything, and so there's no expectation or you know, this sort of. I've been to those things where people go forward and make right. But what you can do is start to make that the conversation and change. And so if I go back to what I said about that call out, if you even just start applying those principles of decide what to decide, when to decide, how to decide, who to decide, and why you decide, and you start applying them against your governing systems. When I say applying them, that means so they go away here and take those and go and make changes and say, don't tell me to make what I'm saying is go away and use them as a diagnostic, right? Against your system so that you can have that conversation, so that you can start to apply that with your leadership and say, well, this is what we're doing. Why are we doing this? Can we not see the inefficiencies in here? So remember, transparency, sensible transparency, we call it, not radical, sensible, because you have to have a sensible conversation with your leadership. You have to have a sensible conversation with your risk people and funding and governance to be able to make these changes. So that's a big call for me. The second one is think about your data. I'm probably stepping on Phil's fingers here, but fact-based data, right? How do you get fact-based data? You got to measure, and you got to measure the right things. So you got to make sure you go and examine what you're actually measuring. Phil, I'll step off your.
Jimmy, how many put your hand up if you're an agile coach before I say anything. Too many agile coaches won't measure stuff. Like in the past, like I don't know what it's like now because I think it's probably a different world, a different market. So kind of when I used to sort of working in and around agile coaches, there's also this fear of, well, we can't measure the team, we can't possibly put measurements on them. Of course you can, as long as it's actually at a team level and those are things that matter to the organization. There's no fundamental problem with that. So yeah, Tony, get comfortable with the fact that you are part of a larger thing and that larger thing cares about what you're doing and it's going to verify what you're doing. It comes back to sort of that quote a bit earlier. So we'll trust you to get on with stuff, but we're going to verify it. So that means we're going to ask you questions. Yeah, you told me you're agile. Show me the process you're following. We don't have one. Well, you're not very agile, are you? Because if you were, you'd have mapped out the steps that your team are going to go through to actually execute work. So I think it's that kind of real acceptance that measurements are important. The second most important thing, obviously buy a copy of the book, but that goes without saying. They'll give you a bunch of ideas that you can take away and start to think about tomorrow. But one of the things we're actually about to roll out, which might be useful, and I don't want to do too many plugs today because that's not what this is for, is we're going to roll out a governance assessment, just a free one, online check where anyone can jump on and go, look, my organization works like this today. What does that actually mean against all these sort of different things I might want to think about? So maybe I'll share it with you guys a bit later when we sort of roll it out. And you can actually just have a look at that and go, well, because I think the important part is the type of things you need to look for and questions you need to ask are different. So if you want different governance, you've got to ask different questions of the work and the system. Otherwise, you can't then explain that to other people. So I kind of think getting familiar with what different looks like is really important. Doing a bit of reading, doing a bit of learning, and then going, how then do I apply that here with a language that firstly people will understand, but also sort of reflects where you want the organization to go, because language is really important. So if everything's just in current language, you're not going to shift anything. So you really want to go, well, what's the future language and story that I want to present? So I think learning that stuff's really, really important.
And the one I'm going to say now, Mark, you've heard me say this before because we've worked together before. But I'll just preface it by saying for all the agents in the room, and I'll let them come up with a pitchfork because I'm on the other side of the screen. Do not be afraid of standardization. Be afraid of normalization, but do not be afraid of standardization. Here's the reason why. If you want sensible transparency, if you want the ability to create flow, if you want to have that ability to govern your system in a conductive way, you need, in an enterprise situation, you need standardization. That doesn't mean that it normalizes. So my difference is that how do you break the work down? Because you can't see. I'll give you an example. I walked into an organization, I'm trying to help them, and the first thing I do is I walk around. And these teams over here, they were breaking their work down feature epic story. Oh, that's cool. This one over here is using epic feature story. I don't care which way you do it. This one over here was using bananas. This one over here, the product owner, I don't even know what the hell they're doing over there. They're doing some sort of thing with cards and all sorts of things, right? The reality is, how do you roll that up? I'll tell you what happens if you don't standardize that kind of thing is you end up with a centralized division who's responsible for taking all that information, who's responsible for governing all your decisions, who's responsible for purveying the information. So you need to be able to standardize that to enable your workflow tool, to create the sensible transparency, to be able to give you that strategic intent to your execution and execute the strategic intent. In saying that, it should never be normalized, right? So that's never saying, well, this team's work is the same as that team. It's how you refer to it and the reference of it and how you break it down so you can have that same kind of conversation.
And to bring that to life, Tony, I got in to do some work with me in my last organization. That's exactly what the job was. So we were using a particular workflow management system where we had 110 different work item types. We narrowed that down to 4. We had thousands of different templates on how to use this workflow management system. We narrowed that down to about 8 or 9, which are just how work could go through it. What we didn't do, and we did a change journey and migration and picked people up, like 70 odd different delivery teams, picked them up, put them on the new processes that we want, the new practice that we wanted. These are the pillars. What we didn't do is then go to those teams and go, you now need to work like this. What we did is this is how you trace your work through the system. Everything else, go figure out yourself. You want to do stand-ups, you want to do agile, you want to do scrum, you want to do lean, I don't care. But this is the way that you're going to trace work through the system. And that was a not negotiable. And had that signed off and backed by the CIO and actually the CEO, because they're the ones who then have to turn around and go, I'm influencing this because I can see the value, so I'm behind it. And you need to get that messaging as well. So that idea of shifting to standards on some things is super critical at organizational scale, or you don't get modern organizational governance because you don't get the data. So the other bit that Tony probably, to build on Tony's comment as well, so then you get a leader. Let's say, for example, the CEO comes down. What are you doing there? Oh, we're estimating. What in? Apples. Right. You're estimating in apples. Then he goes to the team over there and he goes, what are you estimating in? Oh no, we're building a skateboard and then we're going to add a bit to it and it's going to be a motorbike. Then we're going to add a little bit more and it's going to be a car. So what the hell are you talking about? So you've got a leader who's responsible for outcomes and delivery, has no idea how you're working. So now they can turn around and go, okay, you're doing epic feature stories tasks. Great. What are you working on at the moment? Where is that in your life cycle state? Talk to me about that. And he can go to any team and ask that question. And at the end of the day, I think that's what we forget a little bit when we're working at a team level. This stuff bubbles up to someone who works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which is generally most CEOs. And he's on the hook for something, an outcome, the organization performance, 1,000 things. So if you can make his job simpler, then that's kind of going to make it easier for you too. And I think we forget that a little bit sometimes.
Some great call outs there, Tony. Phil, it's key takeaway for me is think about who's going to consume it. It's generally going to be someone senior. And then what are the practical things that we can do to make sure that those things roll up? I know governance and these type of topics can be quite interesting sometimes, but always enjoyed talking to you both, Tony and Phil, around this topic.